Welcome to Smart Talk. On this program, we hold discussions with leading economists and social scientists from around the world. There are no rules about what topics are brought to the table. Today's guest joining us via Skype is Herman Daly. Mr. Daly is an ecological economist and professor at the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland. He is a former senior economist in the environmental department of the World Bank, where he helped develop policy guidelines related to sustainable development. I'm Andrew Mazzone, president of the Henry George School of Social Science, and this is Smart Talk. Okay, Herman, thanks for joining us. Now,
My pleasure.
This interview is going to be a little unusual because you're following a great classical scholar named Mark Blyth, and we had a far-ranging interview which bumped up into the issues you and I are going to discuss. Mark Blyth is a Scottish economist at Brown, and he's written a powerful book called Austerity, and also he's written a book called Transformations, which is kind of the lineal descendant of Karl Polanyi. And we were discussing Greece, austerity, and all of the issues of economics, neoclassical, classical. And I was trying to say, well, what's the solution here? Do you understand that the solution will probably be environmental limitations? And so I try to make the argument, yes, we can't, much of this is path dependent and driven by the economics and the property rights structures that we have, but the pressures will be so intolerable that something has to give. And he said, well, nothing will really give, we'll just muddle on and on. So we had an impasse here. So I knew I was going to talk to you. And I think we could pick it up there. I asserted to him, I said, there's a finite calculation that we can make now. I mean, and I think I'm drawing from your work where essentially if we double the GNP worldwide, given just keeping technology the way it is now, that our environment will become damaged to the point of no return. Your comments?
Well, I think that will happen. He may well be right in the sense that we're not going to do anything about it, and that we'll be simply forced in a kind of Malthusian way to deal with it after the fact, to pick up the pieces and try to put them back together. This is something that my students always raised with me. They would say, yes, well, Professor Daly, what you say is all very reasonable, but nobody will ever accept it. Congress will never enact limits to growth. And well, I don't have a very good answer except to say that, their implicit question was, why should we study this? And it's good to have some ideas on the shelf for reconstruction. You get serious after a crisis, and if there's something on the shelf already, that helps. So that may well be our state. Now, naturally, I hope we will be able to be a little bit more anticipatory and avoid some of and that's what I aim for. But I have to admit that, it may not happen.
All right, well, Herman, let me just say this. Of course, I'm not a nihilist here, and I believe that that this can be headed off. And as a Georgist, more of a neo-Georgist, let's say, I would argue that tax on nature and land, as an ultimate tax on bads, environmental bads, even if you had to shadow price them into the system, would go a long way to break the path dependency that the current structures have thrown us on. So in a way, I would argue that although I haven't got a closed-end solution, and I certainly can't argue against humanity's lack of focus on this particular issue, that some pointed structural changes might at least change the paths that we're on. But I didn't intend to debate George here. I wanted to debate Herman Daly's view of what the environmental issues are.
I mean, in a way, the question sort of is, how do you envision a successful economy that's not growing? How do you envision a successful steady state? Well, I think it's helpful to start with a prior question. How do you envision a successful planet Earth that is not growing? Well, that's pretty easy because we already have one. The Earth is not growing in its physical dimensions. Lots of things are changing. There's evolution, there's birth, there's death, there's production, there's depreciation, and there's technical change, and so on and so on. But the Earth is not growing. The economy is a physical subsystem of the Earth. And if it keeps on growing in its physical dimensions, eventually it approximates the dimensions of the Earth, at which time it will perforce be a steady state, whether it wants to or not. And so we would be much better off to adapt to this basic plan of steady state, non-growth in physical dimensions at an optimal level rather than at the maximum level, because at the maximum level, the costs are going to be much greater than the benefits, and we will suffer a lot. So that's my basic perspective. And as for the Georgist position, I've been very much, my first course in economics was history of thought, and I was very impressed by Henry George. And as you probably know, history of thought is no longer taught in economics faculty. We already know everything, so why talk about the errors of the past? That seems to be the attitude. But I would suggest a kind of generalization of Henry George, which I think has already been made by others. And we tax, let's stop taxing value added. Value added is something we want more of. Value added is added by labor and by capital. Stop taxing that, or reduce taxations on value added, and make it up by taxing that to which value is added, namely the natural resource flow through the land, the entropic flow of resources, energy and matter. That's what's ultimately scarce. We need to increase the productivity of that. And, in terms of fairness and equity, it's something that nobody produced. The returns to it are largely rents, just like spatial rents so there's all sorts of good reasons for shifting the tax base gradually away from labor and capital and onto the natural resource flow. So in that sense, I would say, well, I really am in sort of a Georgist, it seems to me, in that way.
All right, let me take another one of your observations on managing the environment to make the case to go steady state. You have a very compelling argument against free trade. Now Henry George is a free trader, and I don't happen to be a free trader because there is no Georgist system, and without a Georgist system, free trade becomes an absurdity. But you make a point that's even larger than that. You're basically saying that free trade is trashing, forget the comparative advantage on product A, product B, but you're taking apart civilizations, societies, and nations by doing this, and in so doing it, you're breaking down regional government, which would be available to perhaps legislate environmental solutions if they could.
Yes, well, I think that's true. I think free trade very easily gets generalized into globalization. So you talk about free exchange of goods and services across national boundaries. And then the next step, we say, well, free capital mobility across national boundaries. And then the third step, we say, well, free migration across national boundaries. Well, if those three things cross national boundaries in a deregulated way, freely, then you've pretty well disintegrated the national unit. The borders don't make any difference. There are no boundaries and there's no nation. And people don't like boundaries. You hear nice sentimental songs about a world with no borders. Well, that's very fine, except when a world with no borders has no community. And a world with no community has no basis for policy. So I think that we really must, while I certainly know that it's hard to make a case in favor of nationalism after two world wars, nevertheless, the idea that you can just suddenly leap to a global community seems to me to be extremely naive.
I'll pick up on Mark Blyth's really an extension of Polanyi, the argument of embeddedness versus a freestanding market economy which kind of hangs out there and depends on its own internal logic to keep it together. Whereas a Polanyi and a Blyth would argue, you can't disembed an economy, you can't take it out of its probably its regional homes and everything, and essentially have a good result long term, that the market itself, disconnected from society, ends up in an explosive way, much like we've seen in 2008 and today.
Yes, well, I guess this is being played out right now in Europe with the conflicts between among the European nations, particularly Greece. My own view is that, I mean, I understand the historical context of working for peace and trying to keep Germany and France from going to war again and all of that, and respect those reasons. Nevertheless, it seems to me that a European common currency, the euro, is a little bit like, taking a group of dogs which occasionally growl at each other but live basically peacefully, and tying their tails all together. They're not going to live in peace in that way. When one moves, it's going to hurt the others, and so this idea of a common currency seemed to me to have enormous costs from the community point of view of each nation, and relatively few benefits. I just don't really see the great benefit of a common currency for Europe. So in that sense, I think tying all the tails together, you're sort of trying to make Germans into Finns and Greeks into Germans. So, and I don't think that's either necessary or a good idea. So, in a way, I'm a outlier on that, and I'll just comment that it seems to me, I may not be totally up on the history, but it seems to me that every time there's been anything like a plebiscite in Europe regarding issues of the common market, it's been defeated. People don't want it, and yet it's being pushed on them from above by an elite. And I think that's what's wrong with it, and what's wrong with a lot of things in the US as well.
Well, let me argue here. I don't want to get conspiratorial here because, elites have been with us for thousands of years. It's kind of a spontaneous eruption of able people who get together and, in the Smithian way, conspire to do everybody else in. So it's almost a spontaneous eruption of abilities. But in this particular case, the elite neoliberal project, along with austerity, has the characteristics of taking care of a certain percentage of the population and basically slowing down the access to wealth of the greater majority of the population on the earth. And you could argue that maybe that's a felt sense on elites' part, that they're slowing down environmental degradation, they're living okay, but they're not going to take they're not going to take 5.5 billion Earthlings with them. Their lives are in 1 or 2 generations, and they're good. And now I don't know if that's a felt or an instinctive need for this, but it seems that the austerity programs, as opposed to the expansion programs, have kind of a feel to them of keeping everybody in place. It's like a straitjacket feudalism.
Yeah, they think they're in a good place, and perhaps for 50 or 100 years, they may well be in a relatively good place compared to other people. But even a relatively good place in a world in which the climate is turned upside down, and which you have riots and rebellions and so forth, is going to be a difficult place even for the elite, even the most deserving elites, are going to have a hard time with that. And I think in a way, why do they think they're in such good shape? Why do they? Well, most of these people are involved in finance in some way or another, and they see the world through the lens of money.
Well, I would argue that essentially the finance and the mindset of these people are pretty much path determined by now, and they wouldn't know how to unwind this structure, even if individually, consciously, they understand that it's a rocket going to nowhere. The argument would be to themselves, would be, well, it's the best for all of us, but I'm doing pretty good, and I'm not going to rock the boat. And I think you're fighting structures that robust, that powerful, and they feel pretty good while you're doing it. But going away from that, an argument against that, I wanted to take what I felt was a powerful calculation and estimate that you made in your book Beyond Growth, that the rates of resource depletion are excessive, and that technology compounding the way it is, it's only 150 years or so that the Industrial Revolution and carbon fuels rocketed us into a different ball game. The human history remembers 10,000 years of essentially no growth, and now we've got this rocket ship that exponentially is really pushing onto the environment. And you made the calculation, I think, that if we took the current GNP worldwide and we doubled it, and doubled the population, in effect created two worlds within the confines of this limited sphere, that essentially the game would be up.
The other thing that's insane about it, just projecting GDP by just its physical content makes it insane. But it's even more insane if you realize that GDP, as we calculate it, is a conflation of both costs and benefits. It includes a lot of real benefits, for sure, but it also includes costs, regrettably necessary expenditures, as the national income accountants term them. The depletion of natural capital, and much of these, for example, the cleanup costs of pollution are entered positively in GDP, whereas there's no offsetting negative entry for actual pollution itself.
Well, a friend of yours, apparently, you had the discussion, which cracked me up. I guess you were at the World Bank when you tried to get that discussion about calculating economic costs as part of a GNP calculation. And I think Larry Summers had said, well, that's really not the way to look at this. Now, Larry is always at the forefront of the latest economic fad. He became a neoliberal, and now he's recanted, and he's discovered that doesn't work, and now he's kind of a left Keynesian again. But it's certainly he's not an environmentalist yet.
Well, who knows? I sometimes have this vision in the future that some economists, like Summers perhaps, will, as a result of some mathematical calculation that he did himself, he'll suddenly come to a realization and say, oh, growth can't go on forever, and present it as if this were an original discovery and get another Nobel Prize for it.
All right. Let me just digress a little from that, talking about growth. Given the structure and the claims that are extant in the world economy today that need to be satisfied by interest payments, growth, the stoppage of growth would, of course, make all of the claims on the economy valueless, so that you'd have just this tremendous upheaval of the wealthiest people in the world. Basically, their wealth becomes shattered. So there's no incentive for people who hold claims on wealth to encourage a no-growth economy, which is essentially the way it has to go. No growth is going to do severe damage to the claims on the economy as it now exists. So I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Their claims on the economy as it now exists In other words, the existing wealth is all claimed, and existing things exist, and the wealth claims on that will still exist. What's not going to exist anymore is the claims on future growth, which is debt. And so we've been multiplying claims on future growth at an enormous rate, and that's debt. So there's a huge debt overhang way over and above the actual physical wealth of the economy. So I think what's going to collapse is the debt overhang.
Okay, well, of course, the debt on current existing wealth has nominally increased phenomenally because of the bidding up of all resources, and so that you got a conflation of both the future and the current. But assuming that resolves in an explosion, let's talk about GNP accounting. Do you think that is other than taxing as we advocate on natural resources, etc., the GNP accounting where you're forced rigorously to restate GNP with the bads fully accounted for? Structurally, what do you think that might do to ameliorate this problem that we're coming up against?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea, and I would push in that direction. And John Cobb and I, and Clifford Cobb, who is incidentally a Georgist, had developed the Index of Sustainable Economic Welfare, in which we tried to separate out costs and benefits and give some kind of implicit shadow pricing valuation to the costs, and then balance them against the benefits. That was, I think, sufficient to show that we were being badly misled by GDP accounting. Whether or not we could correct national accounts to the extent that we could really measure an optimum is, in my mind, a little bit questionable. When you mentioned shadow pricing, I mean, and that's what we sort of are involved in that. But I think this the shadow pricing is the attempt by economists to put a monetary value on non-market environmental assets equivalent to what their value would be if they were traded in a competitive market. That's very hypothetical. And they really don't know what they're doing in most cases. And they resort to really crazy things like contingent valuation and stuff like that.
Let's say we bypassed shadow pricing and went directly to engineering estimation.
But what I would suggest is taking a different approach. Instead of trying to calculate the right price and then expecting the right quantities to result through the market, I would start with an ecological approach and try to come up with the right quantities which are ecologically sustainable and impose those by quotas, and then let the market calculate the corresponding price at which they would exchange.
Well, why not put taxes on those then?
Well, sure, I'm all in favor of taxes on as I said before, on the basic resource flow as opposed to the labor and capital. However, one way of imposing a tax is through a quantitative limit. You limit the quantity, and then you auction off the right to use that quantity, and you capture the rents of the resource in a rather Georgist fashion. You capture the rents by auctioning the limited quantity. So that would then be a way of raising the price of the resource and capturing the rents for public purposes.
What about a third world countries that can only sell their resources? They don't have the offsetting industry or the ability to be self-sustaining unless they sell off their patrimony. And of course, a first world country is not a problem for them. Someone else is suffering.
Yeah, this has been the a long debate in economic development circles and theory. You know, do you have what export-led development or import substitution development? And I have been very much in favor of import substitution development for developing countries. That's the way the United States developed, and the other countries under tariff protection was import substitution. And that, I think, worked fairly well.
Well, then the Treasury Department, American Treasury Department would argue with you here, I think. They would say, look, we had export-led national development and tariffs in England when it started, in the United States in the 1800s to 1870 when it started, Germany from 1870 to World War I when it started, and that it's a proven in Japan now and Korea now and so forth, with us being the recipient of the exports.
Yeah, I think that international trade is very much overemphasized, that it ought to be sort of the icing on the cake and not the cake itself. Domestic production for domestic consumption should be what is basic, and then you trade for things that you that are too difficult to. I mean, it doesn't make any sense for the United States to export Danish butter cookies to Denmark, and for Denmark to export Danish butter cookies to the United States. You know, they cross each other over the Atlantic somewhere. You spend a whole lot of fossil fuels, and you get zero, increase in welfare from this.
Well, of course, the argument would then be that these smaller countries like Denmark would not have enough of an industry to carry a balanced development to fill the needs of their population. So you almost have to go to a regional bloc type country.
Okay, there is such a thing as an optimal size of a nation where you can produce most goods, without. But I mean, take even a small country like Uruguay, where I spent some time. You look at, well, you'd say Uruguay has to trade for everything. Trade is the most important thing for Uruguay. It's a small country. Well, okay, look at some of the costs. If you're an Uruguayan and your comparative advantage options are either you're going to be a shepherd or a cowboy, one or the other, a pastor or a vaquero, and that's it. If you want to play in a symphony orchestra, forget it. You'll have to immigrate. Or if you want to be an airline pilot, you'll have to immigrate. Well, actually, Uruguay said, no, we're going to have a symphony orchestra. And so they have a symphony orchestra. It's not as good as the symphonies they could import. And they're going to have a national airline company. And so some are going to be pilots. Maybe it's not as great a company as some of the others, but they can do a whole lot of things on their own, and it without just surrendering their national identity.
But we could also argue technology would bulk up these little countries to enable them to do more with less. But of course, technology then becomes impinging upon the overall global system, so that's not really a way out for little countries either. So we have a situation, I think, that you've described accurately. Humanity is going to bounce up against some impassable limits because this is a closed system, any way you cut it. And we cannot create man-made capital to replace nature. That is clear.
Well, one thing that I'm very glad to hear you say, that you can't just substitute man-made capital for natural capital, for natural resources. And yet, this is the answer of the neoclassical economists. You look at neoclassical production functions, the Cobb-Douglas type, multiplicative, and what do they consist of? Well, they consist of labor and capital. They leave out resources altogether. But now once in a while, under criticism, they'll bring in resources. So resources are considered totally substitutable by man-made capital, when in fact, there is a relation of complementarity, not substitutability. There's a relation of limiting factor. What used to be the limiting factor in production was labor and capital. How many fish can you catch? Depends on how many fishermen and how many fishing boats. Not anymore. How many fish you catch now depends on the natural capital of the fish population in the sea. So the limiting factor has changed. It's no longer labor and capital, it's remaining natural capital. And economists have not recognized that. I mean, they've avoided it in several ways.
Now, anyone who reads your book who's got half a brain can get this concept. I mean, this is not, and I'm sure your students get this concept.
Yeah.
I mean, neoclassical economists are not stupid. I mean, they're very good mathematicians, if nothing else.
You know, sometimes I feel like a complete fraud. You know, I say, everything I'm saying is just obvious common sense, or it follows immediately from the laws of thermodynamics, which are no secret. So what's going on here? Why? Well, it's just that over a long period of time, a lot of very important economists, it seems, this is my self-serving explanation. A lot of very important economists have been very wrong about a very important question regarding growth for a very long time. And it's pretty hard to admit that, because a whole lot is going to have to be rewritten. And they don't seem to be willing to face up to it. And there are a lot of material and intellectual vested interests in the current model of growth. I mean, you've alluded already to the huge financial consequences of writing down growth, and there are intellectual consequences for economists and others as well. So I'd like to have a better answer than that, but that's where I am now.
Herman, I think we're going to cut this interview, although I hate to do this because I think you're a lifeline to a lot of what has to happen. And I hope you never get discouraged about what you're doing. I really hope. I hope your students understand what you're supplying them. And I hope the world reads your books and understands. I have to say, I'm trained as both a Marxist and a neoclassical economist. And I felt that when I read you, the truth had somewhat dawned. Although I'm a Georgist, it's true, and I kind of get the general idea. You've made it compelling, and I think people should follow what you have to say. And the more you can sharpen the estimates of when the crisis will really come, and the more you and your associates can sharpen that up, the better for all of us, because I think it's going to take an impending awareness of just how close run this thing is becoming from a human standpoint. But anyway, thanks for joining us. It was terrific.
Well, thank you. I'll keep trying, and I hope you do too. Thanks again.
And that's it for this edition of Smart Talk. In upcoming shows, we will be talking to such renowned economists as Stephen Haber. Mr. Haber is a professor at Stanford University and is best known for his work on the political institutions and economic policies that impede improvements in living standards. Please post your questions or comments on our website at henrygeorgeschool.org. I'm Andrew Mazzone. We will see you again next time.